Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, Innovative Evaluation in New Mexico. My name is Edward Seiler, and I am an economist at the Louisiana Legislative Auditor's Office, and I will be moderating our webinar today. I'd like to thank the National Legislative Program Evaluation Society and the National Conference of State Legislatures for sponsoring this webinar. NLPES is the NCSL Staff Association for legislative staff involved in program evaluation or performance auditing. One of its key purposes is promoting professional development opportunities like this webinar for legislative staff. So we are pleased that we could bring you this program today. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the NCSL website. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through our chat box. So feel free to type your questions and answer any questions in the chat box, which is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. To build some comfort with the chat function and also to learn who is on the line today, please feel free to type the state from which you are calling or listening in from. And I also want to mention the resources for the webinar. Above the presentation, you will see a couple of tabs. One is labeled Resources. Here you can find and download a PDF version of the PowerPoint as well as other handouts. Another tab is labeled Speaker, and this is where you can read short biographies for today's speakers. You can access these tabs at any time during the presentation. And today, our speakers, over the next 60 minutes, today we have our speakers for today will be Sarah Dinses, a program evaluator at the New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee, or LFC, and we also have Allison Nichols, a senior fiscal analyst at the LFC. And so with that, Sarah and Allison, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Ed. This is Allison, and I'm here with Sarah. Over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll present a bit about some innovative evaluation that we recently did in New Mexico. I'll talk briefly about our legislative office, the Legislative Finance Committee, and our work, as well as about the partner that we worked on this evaluation with, the Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT. And then we'll briefly explain why we decided to evaluate early college high schools, what we did, what we found, some policy implications, and then some lessons learned, which hopefully could be helpful to other legislative offices. So our office, the Legislative Finance Committee, has been around since 1957. We're full-time, nonpartisan legislative staff. We have three main groups in our office, a group of fiscal analysts that develop budget recommendations for agencies and also do some policy analysis around agency activities and performance. We also have economists that do revenue estimation for the state's finances, as well as a team of program evaluators that ensure accountability in government by performing evaluations of various state agencies, initiatives, programs, etc. Our program evaluation covers pretty much all functions of state government. We typically focus on K-12 education, as well as higher education, early childhood programs, healthcare, and public safety, but also cover many other areas. And our projects typically take between 3 to 6 months. We work in small teams to perform quantitative and qualitative analysis, and we present our conclusions and recommendations to legislators, as well as sometimes other stakeholders, state entities, occasionally the public as well. The LFC is a bit unique among states, or I guess New Mexico is a bit unique among states in that both the governor and the legislative agency, in this case us, propose a full state budget to the legislature. We're one of only 5 states that has that set up. On our evaluation of early college high schools, we also worked with the Abdul, Latif, Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT, or JPAL, which is a global research center that has a network of professors and researchers around the world that conducts randomized impact evaluations to answer policy questions. They started working internationally, and now they also work domestically. And we received an award from their state and local innovation initiative. And that initiative supports local and state leaders and offices to identify which policies or programs work and which work best, and to try to understand why they work and how we can possibly improve them. The award that we received allowed us to access some technical support from JPAL, so we worked with a researcher as well as some of their office staff to help develop our methodology, answer the research question, and interpret our results. So I'll talk a little bit about why we decided to do this evaluation on early college high schools. But before I get into that, I'll briefly describe the early college high school model for those that aren't familiar with it. An early college high school is a dual enrollment model that helps students graduate from high school while they also earn college credits and sometimes career certifications through a higher education institute. So typically a high school is paired with a college, university, or community college, and students will simultaneously get high school credit and college credit. The early college high school differs from a traditional dual credit curriculum in that it offers a cohesive integrated curriculum that integrates both the high school and college level coursework. So typically students start out with high school coursework and then will move into college coursework during the second and third year of the program. Most of these programs are 3 years long. Early college high schools can be either located on a college campus or at a high school, but will have professors from the college typically or accredited high school teachers that are teaching the college portion of the program. The early college high school model is really designed to target students that are underrepresented in higher education. So typically that would be low-income students or students who would be the first in their family to go to college. The model is an evidence-based practice. For example, the U.S. Department of Education's What Works Clearinghouse lists it as an evidence-based practice. And there's been research in other states that has showed that this is effective in getting students to enroll in and obtain degrees from college. So you can see in the chart on the right, one of the more comprehensive studies that's been done to date was done by the American Institutes for Research. And you can see that there's a difference in the percentage of students that enrolled in college between early college high school attendees and then a control group that did not attend the early college high school. So why did we decide to evaluate early college high schools in New Mexico? Kind of two main reasons. One is that this model's really grown a lot nationally. It launched in a kind of a wide-scale way around 2001. The Gates Foundation launched an early college high school initiative, and that was around the same time that we started seeing early college high schools pop up in New Mexico. So today there are about 3,000 students across 20 schools. So it's grown a lot, and I guess you could say it's gotten a lot of hype, both nationally and here in New Mexico. So for example, our public education department has started a certification program, which is great. We definitely, want to get more kind of rigor on certification. However, we haven't done any research in our state about if this is actually working for students. So we felt like it was important to look into that. Then the second reason why we decided to do this evaluation was that we realized that the way that early college high schools admit students is a great opportunity for experimental or quasi-experimental analysis. Some early college high schools use a randomized open access lottery to admit students. They're all supposed to use a randomized open access lottery. It turned out that some didn't, which is sort of another issue around compliance, but I can talk about that more if anyone's interested. So, before we did this research, we already had some correlational research around early college high schools in the state. So for example, we knew that on some measures of student and school performance, they definitely perform better. For example, you can see in the the first chart, that early college high schools get better school grades, graded by our public education department. They're a lot more likely to get A's or B's than public schools in general in New Mexico. And we also knew that they had higher four-year graduation rates than their districts overall. So, that's definitely promising. However, we also know that their student populations differ in ways that are probably pretty meaningful. For example, they have lower rates of students that are eligible for free and reduced lunch, which is a proxy for low-income status. So you can see in the chart on the right, about half of students at early college high schools are eligible for free and reduced lunch. That number is over 2/3 both statewide and then in the districts where the early college high schools are located. Early college high schools also have lower shares of Hispanic and Native American students. And in addition, students in early college high schools could also differ on, other important characteristics. They may have more family support. They may have differing academic performance before they come into the early college high school. So, given that it's really hard without doing experimental or quasi-experimental research to attribute any positive outcomes of early college high schools to the schools themselves. So that was really what we wanted to answer. Does attending the early college high school lead to better outcomes versus just do students who go to early college high schools happen to have better outcomes? So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about specifically what we did and what we found.
Thanks, Allison. As you did a really good job of introducing, we really wanted to examine whether attending an early college high school would lead to improved post-secondary outcomes, or like college enrollment and college degree attainment, compared to students who did not attend an early college high school. And as you also set up, one of the reasons why we need to do a quasi-experimental analysis or an experimental analysis for these types of programs is because the groups are very different for the students who attend these types of schools versus those individuals who do not. And so initially our hope was to use a randomized control trial because many of these schools use some type of lottery setup. However, as we started digging more into the data, we learned that only 2 schools randomized their lotteries and also retained their records. And so that created our initial hurdle as to whether we could do a true randomized control trial or not. If you look at the figure on the right of the screen, you'll see that for most lottery setups, you'll have an applicant pool, and then these applicants will go into some type of admissions lottery and then will be selected either as an early college high school student or a non-early college high school student. And from there, we can measure our outcomes, which were degree attainment and college enrollment. However, as we learned more about these programs, we found out that a number of the schools had an admissions lottery that wasn't truly randomized. For instance, siblings were frequently admitted, and there could also be other key characteristics that would lead to an individual getting admitted. And so because of that, we didn't feel that the setup was truly randomized, and therefore, rather than doing a true randomized control trial, here we're doing more of a quasi-experimental analysis. This was a key challenge within the evaluation because initially we had this expectation that we were doing a randomized control trial, and that is what we had applied for with JPAL. And Allison will talk a little bit more about some of those challenges and lessons learned as we move forward. So within this study, we used records from existing data that we had from the schools who retained their records, so we knew who had applied to enroll in an early college high school as well as who did enroll in an early college high school. Additionally, we collected data from the National Student Clearinghouse, which is a national database of individuals' college entrance and degree attainment, and we were able to access this data for a nominal fee for each student. Once we received this information, we analyzed the differences between these 2 groups, and to help us do this, we worked with JPAL, as Allison has already briefly mentioned. Moving forward, what we saw was that we saw that there was a significant difference in any degree attainment. So individuals who enrolled in an early college high school were more likely to have any type of degree compared to our control group. And this is characterized mostly by associate's and bachelor's degrees, which is that first figure, where we see that for associate's degrees there was a like a 3-point difference,
yeah, 4 points.
And 3 or 4 point difference for associate's degrees as well as for bachelor's degrees. And then there was a non-significant difference for master's degrees, which we don't get into here, and that's simply because we weren't looking at, we only had a 6-year longitudinal framework, and because we didn't have a large horizon time frame, we couldn't really see any effects in terms of master's degrees. Additionally, in all of these analyses, we controlled for our free and reduced price lunch and English learner status to make sure that there weren't any significant demographic differences in these groups that could lead to differences in their enrollment or degree attainment. We also see that students who were in an early college high school for the full treatment effect, which was 3 years, had a significantly higher rate of degree attainment than those individuals who were only in the program for 1 year or those who were not enrolled in the program. Furthermore, we didn't do as detailed of an analysis on enrollment as we were expecting, because we didn't have enough data as to why students had not enrolled in programs. And because of this, we felt like we didn't have the ability to know whether the impact, them not being enrolled in a program was due to the treatment effect or whether it was due to some other extraneous factor. Based upon this information, we concluded that early college high schools seemed to be fairly promising, and that through enrollment in early college high schools, you can have better post-secondary outcomes, specifically if you're enrolled for the full treatment effect. However, we need to have more rigorous statewide evaluations of these programs, and we actually suggested this to our public education department. Hopefully they're working on that. We also believe that we should be requiring students to keep their records, which is actually state law, because if individuals kept their records, we would be able to look at a much larger sample size, which could actually lead to the similar effects that were shown nationwide. And I'm going to turn it back over to Allison for lessons learned.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'll talk about a few things that we learned during this study, which may be relevant to other legislative offices that are thinking about doing experimental or quasi-experimental research. So, one thing that's really important to think about is what the feasibility or how feasible it is for your office to do a prospective study versus a retrospective study. So, if you have the opportunity, doing a prospective study definitely allows for more rigorous research, because you can design the study, you can, hopefully have some influence over the parameters, you can kind of gather the data that you need, making it more likely that it will be truly randomized. However, as was the case for our office and probably some other legislative offices, timeline, scope, capacity, can make it pretty difficult to do this. Some prospective studies, could take years, and we simply did not have the time to do that. On the other hand, retrospective studies are definitely a little easier because the data already exists, or at least in theory exists. But the trade-off there is that you don't have a lot of control over how the data. Well, you have no control over how the data was collected. So you might not always have, enough data or enough high-quality data.
Right, and that was one of the issues with this study in particular, because we only had those 2 schools that were randomized as well as who retained their records.
Exactly, yeah. So going forward, Sarah had mentioned that the public education department is is they've actually applied for a grant from the U.S. Department of Education to do a prospective study. So, we hope they do that. I think that would definitely allow for some good, rigorous research. And then a related point on the data and the quality of the data is just getting data as early as possible and being able to verify the quality and availability of it before you start. So, again, we were able to get some of the data while we were still planning, but weren't able to get data from as many schools as we had hoped. So that did somewhat impact what we were able to do with the study. Also finding that the lotteries, possibly weren't completely randomized, kind of made us change this from a truly experimental to a quasi-experimental study. And then it's also important to think about data sharing. With a lot of experimental or quasi-experimental research, there's a lot of individual level data. So, for example, here we were working with student data, which, as you might expect, is fairly sensitive. So the public education department, understandably, is pretty hesitant to release it. So it took us several months to be able to get the right agreements and kind of security protocols in place, especially because we were also sharing it with outside researchers. That added another layer of complexity. So just important to, think about that before you get started. In terms of conducting randomized controlled trials or experimental research, I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities for legislative offices. So some of the approaches that we're thinking about, looking at are, programs that lend themselves to experimental research. So that could be, like in this case, a program that's oversubscribed and determines admission by lottery or possibly by wait list. So some other programs that could meet that criteria would be drug courts in our state, or we know the health department has an oversubscribed program that provides some services to expectant mothers that also relies on a waiting list. Also programs that are rolled out in phases. For example, if there's not enough funding or capacity to roll them out all at once, for example, they'll be rolled out by individual school or prison or county, and that rollout is randomized, or possibly you could work with the agency to encourage them to randomize it. Although that also raises some issues around location, since there might be location characteristics that differ in a non-random way. And then another potential RCT would be when there are 2 or more evidence-based programs offered. So, for example, a health department offers 2 behavioral health programs that are both evidence-based, but participants can be randomly assigned to one of the 2. And that also, I guess all these approaches also help to avoid some of the potential ethical issues that can arise when you're trying to randomize a program and, are concerned about only providing a proven intervention to some individuals. And then finally, we mentioned that we worked with JPAL at MIT, so that's another great way for legislative offices to kind of extend their capacity and scope. JPAL helped us design and execute this research. One thing worth noting is just that we found it was important to clarify project expectations. So, for example, JPAL really focuses on randomized control trials. And as we described, we had to sort of shift the scope of this to more quasi-experimental research. And they were able to work with us and, help us kind of rethink how that would work. But, just important to kind of know what your partner's goals or parameters are, in addition to what your office's goals and parameters are. Sarah, anything else you want to add on lessons learned?
No, but there's one other thing about JPAL that I think might be also useful. They partner you with a researcher, so that can help with other technical expertise. So if JPAL themselves don't have the answer to something, they'll make sure that you're working with somebody else so that your research can hopefully end up being published, as well as so you have that depth of background knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. That was really helpful to have that resource. Well, with that, I think we'll stop here and welcome any questions that you have. Thank you.
All right, Sarah and Allison, thank you so much for your presentation. It's certainly a very interesting topic and exciting to see so much research on with randomization. So I wanted to go ahead and invite members of our audience to ask questions. Please, if you haven't done so already, please type your questions in the chat box at the lower left of your screen, and I will go ahead and forward them to the panelists. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. So actually, I have, just to start, one of the questions I have, I mean, randomization, I think it's actually very timely right now, because I think earlier, I think it was this week, they announced that the winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics for this year were 3 researchers, Esther Duflo, I'm not going to try to pronounce Dr. Banerjee's name, and I think it was Kramer were the 3 who won, all 3 of whom have been doing randomized experiments. And I guess one of the things that I wonder is, in New Mexico, has your legislature, what has been their kind of approach to this subject, and are they really interested in randomized trials? Do they like the idea, and how have they responded to it?
So in New Mexico, we have a process called Legislating for Results, and we focus on performance-based budgeting. And our legislature is really interested in making sure that we're evaluating programs and making sure they work. And along those lines, they are interested in us doing randomized trials, but their main focus is on us examining programs in a timely manner. So there's a kind of a give and take there. One thing that our state just passed was a Senate bill focused on performance management and looking at program inventories of different agencies to ensure that we as a state are using evidence-based programs. But in terms of randomization, it's something that is an ideal, but it doesn't stop us from doing other projects if we can't randomize something.
And I'd also add that, a lot of legislators may not be that familiar with research methods in the first place. So I think part of our job as staff is to educate about why these approaches can be really beneficial, and why they might be worth investing some more time and resources in.
Well, thank you, Sarah and Allison, for answering my question. It is exciting to hear that your legislature has really supported this idea. So we have a question. I'll just go down the list. We have first a question from Kieran McGordy, and Kieran asks, how does your office get assigned evaluations? Are you able to select the topics that lend themselves to this type of method?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we get assigned evaluations. Kind of, it's a bit of a two-way street, or I don't know, probably a multiple-way street. Our legislators, sometimes will kind of submit ideas, requests for programs they want us to look at, and then we as staff, both team members and our managers, also submit ideas of programs we want to look at. So we always kind of have a running list. And then in terms of specifically assigning projects to teams or individuals, again, it's kind of based on individual skill sets and interests combined with programs that are, that we haven't looked at in a while, or that have kind of come up for budgeting, and we want to know how much to budget, or we have concerns about performance. So it's a mix of factors.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is we tend to follow the money. So we as a state spend a lot on Medicaid and education, as probably many other states do. And so because of that, we usually have some evaluation going on that's focused on education, and another evaluation usually focused on some type of Medicaid or healthcare piece. But beyond that, then once we get our list of potential evaluation topics, those will be presented to the legislative committee, and then the committee picks which ones they believe are most timely, and sometimes that is also based upon management recommendations.
Interesting. So it sounds like it's it has a lot of legislative input, and you can kind of curate the list to be ones that would lend themselves to this kind of randomization, but ultimately the legislature has the final say.
Yeah, it's a bit of a collaborative process, and yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I think over time, we're hoping to do more of this type of research. So hoping to, again, provide a bit of education to our legislative members about why this is important.
Terrific. Well, we have another question. I think this is the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee in Washington, and they have a question. What issues or concerns should you think about if you have a wait list that isn't necessarily randomized?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question because that was really what we were dealing with here. And that was ultimately why, well, that was one of the main reasons why we decided that this really couldn't be a truly randomized study, and that's why, we're saying it's quasi-experimental. So, and I guess just to give a little bit more context on that, what happened with the school lotteries that we were looking at, we knew that students went into the lottery, and then, in theory, were picked out at random. However, there was a wait list, and some students on the wait list ended up getting in because other students had dropped out or had gotten in but decided not to go. And that process, if a student is accepted via lottery but decides not to go, and then if a student on the wait list then has the opportunity to, again, go or not go, that process isn't random because there's obviously some decision-making going on there, and that could be affected by student characteristics. You can imagine what they are. They could be anything. Family involvement in the process or prior academic background or something like that. So, I guess in that case, because this is a retrospective study and the data already existed, there was unfortunately, nothing we could really do to kind of get around that. So we did have to shift this to a quasi-experimental study. Obviously, or I don't know, obviously, but if this were a prospective study, you could hopefully work with the schools to say, hey, if you are keeping a wait list, you need to retain records on that. Or Sarah, do you have any other ideas how you would get around that?
There's a lot of issues there, right? Because usually you want to look at the intent to treat, and if an individual was supposed to receive the service but didn't, they're still supposed to be put in the treatment group. And so this can create a lot of gray areas when you're doing the analysis. So I would suggest that you make sure that you can document all of the differences between the groups if possible, and then you can do some different statistical analyses as well, which won't make your study into a randomized control trial, but will allow you to control for some of these effects and therefore give you more reliable results. So oftentimes in our office, we'll end up doing propensity score matching if we have some of these issues, but there are other ways around it as well. Hopefully that answered Jailer's question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it sounds almost like usually we're reactively asking for documents of something that has already happened, but in this case you're saying, it's like before it even happens, be sure to generate this document. It seems like a more proactive approach.
Right. Yeah, because if you were doing a prospective study, you can sit down with the individuals who are going to be collecting the data and kind of think about where do we expect there to be some challenges. And once we can identify those spots, figure out what are some potential solutions to them, and if we can get those solutions or get other additional information, that may hopefully solve the issue.
Well, thank you, Sarah and Allison. We have another question from Eric B. Croft in Virginia, and actually this is similar to a question I have. Did you need to get permission from comparison group members to access their data from the National Student Clearinghouse? And I have a piggyback question. Maybe you could answer with that, and that is, how did that work? Did you go through one of your New Mexico higher ed institutions to get into it, or did you negotiate that with them specifically? Maybe you could talk about that process.
Yeah. So the National Student Clearinghouse gets their data directly from colleges. They have a collaboration with almost every higher education institute in the country, not every single one, but most. So the schools are sending their student data directly to National Student Clearinghouse. So in that sense, no, you don't have to get permission from the comparison group because their data is already in the National Student Clearinghouse. I don't know exactly how it works, at the college level, their kind of management of student data, but once the data gets to National Student Clearinghouse, you can access it. So you can access, full names and date of birth, and then a bunch of information about when they enrolled, what their major was, degrees obtained, graduation, things like that. We work directly with National Student Clearinghouse. They have a service called Student Tracker that different entities and stakeholders can subscribe to. So it's based on a per student cost with some savings for requesting more and more data. So definitely I'd encourage people to reach out to Student Tracker, the Student Tracker team at National Student Clearinghouse. They have a pretty good team that can talk to you about those options. And basically how it works is we submitted a list of students that we wanted to track or match, first name, last name, date of birth, and then National Student Clearinghouse matched those records for us against records from the higher education institutes.
And did you find that matching, did you have any issues with people whose last names might have changed for different reasons? Were you pretty satisfied with the match rates that y'all were able to get?
We did have some issues matching. I want to say we were able to match about 2/3. And we talked to National Student Clearinghouse, and they kind of indicated that was in the ballpark of what the match rate would generally be. Because there definitely could be issues with names that were misspelled or changed or nicknames or whatever. And the main issue there, as Sarah alluded to, was that because of that, we didn't end up doing analysis on college enrollment because we saw that X% of students enrolled in a higher education institute. But then it was hard for us to say, well, if the students didn't show up on that enrollment list, it's because they didn't enroll. We didn't know that for sure. The students might not have showed up on an enrollment list because of those reasons we just talked about, name issues, or they moved out of the country, or they passed away. So that did limit the analysis a little bit.
Well, Sarah and Allison, thanks again for answering those questions. We have another question from Kevin Amirisani, and he asks, what made the study quasi-experimental, or in other words, how did you take into account the non-random nature of most of the school lotteries that you were looking at?
So we classified this as quasi-experimental because, as we said, there is this non-random nature. And so we analyzed the data first to see what the differences were between the two groups. We looked at enrollment and some of the other demographic information that we had. And then we analyzed it controlling for factors that we thought could potentially be different between those groups. And so this isn't the ideal analysis, but it was kind of making the best of what we had.
Right, so it sounds like, the general principles, you're comparing the treatment as whether they went to one of these early college high schools, and so you're looking at the post-treatment outcomes of, whether they, how they did with their higher educational attainment, and you were able to control for their pre-treatment demographic things like free and reduced lunch and English learner status, things like that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I'll add too that, in theory we could have controlled for as many variables as we had data on. So the records from our public education department did indicate students' FRL status, English learner status, ethnicity, I think disability status, gender. So we could have controlled for more factors. We thought those were probably the two most significant factors.
In previous analyses that we've done, those have been the two factors that are most strongly tied to educational outcomes beyond whatever the treatment effect is.
Excellent. Thank you for your answer. We have a question from Deanna Ahmad, and she asks, how are your findings presented to the state legislature in New Mexico? What kind of response did you receive, and do you know about any plans to broaden the availability of early college high school in the state?
Yeah, so we presented our findings at a hearing over the summer to our committee members, Legislative Finance Committee, and I think some, tangible impacts or changes that we're hopefully going to see. So for one thing, we worked a little bit with the Public Education Department around their certification process. I think I mentioned they had, even before we started this, had already been in the process of developing a certification for early college high schools, which is really good because previously pretty much any school could just call themselves an early college high school, and this will put some really clear criteria around, what it means, that you have to have a certain type of curriculum, your teachers have to be accredited, you have to offer X, Y, and Z programs. So, we're in discussions with them about kind of using some more outcomes-based criteria or evaluation in that process. And then, in addition, as I said, we've also been talking to them about their grant proposal to do a prospective study on early college high schools, which we would hopefully maybe be involved in some way. And I think in terms of the response from legislators, I think they were, maybe a bit surprised to hear that there wasn't a lot of kind of rigor around how we're looking at early college high schools to date. So I think that's definitely more on the radar screen now.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sarah and Allison, for your answer to that question. And we have actually, I think, a related question from Brenda, but I think Brenda's asking if there were any changes in state law. I think she's asking, whereas the previous question was maybe dealing with education policy, maybe you could also talk a bit about requirements for schools to maintain data, or anything that legislators would do to, bring your performance-based budgeting in line with something that can be, looked at experimentally or quasi-experimentally. Did they pass any laws regarding data?
No, not yet, and we're hoping to address that down the road a bit. As we did this evaluation, we did see that a lot of schools either weren't running randomized lotteries or they weren't retaining records. We chose not to focus a lot on that at this point, just because we were working collaboratively with the schools and asking them to share data with us, and we felt like if we presented this as some kind of gotcha compliance exercise, that could have been kind of counterproductive. It also could have been kind of counterproductive in the way we were working with the Public Education Department. So we did at this point want to keep it pretty collaborative and just focus on these outcomes from the schools that we were able to evaluate. But that did come up as a concern, and so we do hope to kind of look into that a little bit more.
But it's interesting. You mentioned that we had an audit on our charter school lottery. One of the subjects was that they're required to hold lotteries so that they can make sure that they're getting an equal proportion or the right proportion of economically disadvantaged students. And I think one rural parish, their lottery was being done by a lawyer. Just and there was no records of it. It sounded like something. That'd be very challenging to audit something like that. We have another question. This is a very technical question from the JLARC, and they're asking, they have a specific question about propensity score matching. I think you all mentioned earlier that you were using that. What are your thoughts on recent literature showing that propensity score matching increases imbalance in control groups, and is that something that y'all have looked into, and do you have any alternatives to using propensity score matching? What are your thoughts on that subject?
So I am aware of this literature, but I haven't had a chance to delve into it, so I don't want to talk too much about it, unfortunately. I think what we've been doing we've kind of had a debate in our office even whether we should be doing inferential stats on some of the data that we have, because oftentimes we're looking at population data. And so when you're looking at population data, sometimes there's an argument that you shouldn't be using inferential statistics, because inferential statistics is based on the fact that you're using a sample. And so we haven't kind of figured out yet the best way to go about some of these things. Sometimes we'll do HLMs rather than propensity score matching to try to deal with some of the issues that way. I don't think that fully answers their question, but until I read the literature, I don't want to kind of say more about it.
Well, I think fully answering that question maybe would require a pretty innovative new idea, and it certainly is something that I think a lot of us would be interested in if there's some kind of improved way of doing treatment effects measurement in a quasi-experimental setting like this. I had a question also that I wanted to ask. I know in some papers that I've seen with randomized controlled trials, they have this. They say that there's some kind of experiment number that goes with it, and I'll admit I haven't. I don't remember who it is that maintains this database. Is there a do you know offhand, is this something that the Joint Poverty Action Lab is very invested in? They try to catalog all of these randomized controlled trials, and so as more states potentially are doing these, there's going to be some way to just pull up a list and say, oh wow, we have 10 studies that look at exactly what we're trying to look at.
Yeah, I don't know. That would be cool. I know what they're doing, at least for the state and local innovation program, is helping state and local governments to perform RCTs. I do think on their website they have some kind of catalog, or at least examples of the projects they've worked on. So certainly they'd be a good resource, I think, to reach out to if you are thinking about a specific type of research or specific policy intervention that you want to look at.
Well, that's good to know. And one other question I have, of course, coming at this from an econometric standpoint, we're almost always dealing with quasi-experimental situations, and there are a lot of different techniques that economists try to use to do a natural experiment. You could use difference in differences, or instrumental variables, regression discontinuity, bunching, and other techniques. And the idea of all of these is that you use the term they use is exploit, but it sounds bad. But you make use of some kind of quirk in the way that the program is set up. I think you mentioned this even where you're talking about program that's being rolled out over multiple facilities, and if there's some way to randomize that assignment process. Is the Joint Poverty Action Lab a proponent of using these kind of econometric techniques, or are they really more focused on randomized controlled trials, and how do you approach that distinction?
Yeah, well, so they're definitely more focused, or I'd say almost exclusively focused, as far as I know, on randomized control trials. And in terms of using econometric techniques, I don't know if Sarah had any other discussions with them on that.
I haven't had any discussions with them on that, so that would be a good thing to talk to them about. I think that we're going to try and share their contact information as well. But one thing I will say is I think some of it kind of varies on who you're working with there, because they have a very extensive team, and so they have individuals who specialize in a number of different techniques, and so potentially they would have one or two individuals who know more about econometric techniques rather than some others, more different types of statistical techniques.
Yeah, and I'll enter in the chat box the contact information from the State and Local Innovation Initiative that we worked with, because I think they are interested in getting RCT proposals from state and local governments.
And is it a particular department that it's most closely associated with, or is it going to be the I don't know if they have a public administration program there, but is it economics or sociology, psychology, education? Is it associated with one department or cross-disciplinary?
Yeah, I think it's cross-disciplinary because it is a center that's affiliated with the university, but as far as I know, not within a specific department.
Well, terrific. Yeah, and I would just ask the last question. We wanted to get that contact information for the Joint Poverty Action Lab, and I see Allison has entered it in the chat box. And certainly, if yeah, and there's the email address for the contact person. So certainly, if it's something you're interested in, that would be the person to contact. So with that, again, I'd like to thank our panelists, Sarah and Allison. Thanks to NLPES for setting this up, and thanks to all of you out there who've been joining us today. This webinar has been recorded and archived, and it will be available on the NCSL website next week. So this webinar is now concluded. Thanks again for listening. Goodbye.